um, and Enki must have felt horrible when all these godly powers were stripped of him. He was literally powerless and must have felt he was dying. What Ninurta did is the worst thing you can do to a narcissist who would prefer to die rather than to suffer such punishment. But in all that, Ninurta also made a grave mistake. With Enki gone, he unintentionally put Marduk in power. To Marduk, Enki's imprisonment was excellent news, and he could now basically do as he pleased. Being castrated, Enki's primary worry must have been that his bloodline, the ancient Enki Isis lineage, would die out when he could not be there and repower it. He knew that without his pure bloodline, he couldn't claim humankind as his kind. As his, I mean. He was completely out of the game. When the Matrix was created, it was the Enki Isis bloodline that was the prominent. The rest were random bloodlines of random survivors from the flood. His plans were completely shattered when Ninurta cast him down into the Apsu. He feared his lineage would eventually disappear, and he was rightfully nervous about Marduk. Enki was powerless where he sat, but Marduk was not. He was here on earth, which was to his great advantage, but his time to truly shine was yet to come. He wanted to wait until humankind was ready for his coup that he kept secret to everyone back then. However, I would say that the day Enki was put in the Apsu, he was out of the equation and has been ever since, almost like if he were dead. Yes, he had some minions here on Earth who were still loyal to him, but as we shall see, they soon became quite unimportant and powerless too. From the day Enki disappeared, Marduk's goal was to completely destroy Enki's bloodline and replace it with his. And it all started with Jesus. All right. Marduk presented the Jesus idea to Isis. He wanted Isis to incarnate in the Davidian Shem bloodline as the Virgin Mary, and thus destroy the Enki Isis bloodline. Instead of letting Jesus be born from that bloodline, he was going to be born through virgin birth. Marduk's purpose was to finish Enki's Davidian bloodline, of which both Mary/Isis and her husband, Joseph, were part of. By not having children with Joseph and instead using her androgyny to create Jesus. A careful study of the Bible shows that Mary stuck to her virginity for the rest of her life and never had sex with Joseph or any one other man. The plan Marduk had was to create a completely new bloodline with Isis, without Enki's blood involved, and because Isis gave birth to Jesus androgynously, Jesus' body was purely that of Isis and Ninurta's DNA, no Enki DNA. To that, Marduk added his, and we got Isis Ninurta Marduk DNA in a mix. He wanted to take Enki out of the equation and gain ownership of humankind. So in this sense, you can say the majority of humans are probably now in the ownership of Marduk. So now we need to realize, do we want to have such an owner? Do we want to have and be under ownership of a tyrannical and utterly dark Marduk? Why is it that we are not standing up and say, what, are we being owned by a very tyrannical, psychopathic being known as Marduk that is ruling and reigning here over earth? Do we not uh, want to have our eternal sovereignty claiming back again? Oh yeah, we should do so. Mary was of the Nathan bloodline, and Joseph of his brother Solomon's, both sons of David. He managed to disrupt the Davidian line, but because of unexpected things that happened from Marduk's perspective, he failed to take over at that time. What happened instead is very interesting and perhaps an attempt to save and free humankind. So there are still attempts going on to have the human soul group freed out of the hands of this psychopathic being Marduk. Yeah? And we can help this ourselves by waking up and start to remembering whom we truly are and reclaiming our eternal sovereignty back. I will make my case for that, but we must tell the story in the correct order. For the Jesus story to work, so they could use the same old narrative, they must have a so-called Holy Trinity, and the Trinity that the Bible is teaching is an unholy Trinity and is not a Holy Trinity at all. This Trinity comprised Enki as God, Marduk as the Son, and Isis as the Holy Ghost / Spirit, because Enki, God, was no longer present on earth. They must make him omnipresent and invisible to regular people on earth. So the God of the Bible is Enki. It was a brilliant idea. It would benefit Marduk in more than one way. They could preserve the bloodline. They could create a new religion. And they could get a lot of loosh. What is loosh? That is human soul energy that they are stealing on daily basis from us in many ways, shapes, and forms. This is why we are dealing with a worldly / global daily traumatization of each and every human soul. So you can say MK Ultra is now worldwide. From millions of humans worshiping them. Yeah, so the Christian people, and especially the ones in churches, need to wake up and need to see whom they are really worshiping. Not the real God. They are worshiping an Enki and a Marduk. Yeah? And Isis. In addition, Marduk could also receive the praise and the loosh directed to both God and Jesus, because with Enki out of the equation, Marduk could put himself as both the Father and the Son. So this means that in the New Testament, the God that is being spoken of in the New Testament is Marduk, and Jesus is also Marduk. Yeah? So now we get to understand this so-called Trinity. But that was not all. The long-term goal was to preserve this new Jesus bloodline so when the world would be ready for the singularity, comma, the 3% of humankind that the overlords need to attack Orion universe with should all have his DNA. His means Marduk's DNA in their cyborg bodies, and nothing of Enki's. Today, genetic scientists tell us that in the next few generations, mothers will no longer give birth to children. Babies will be produced in laboratories. This is already going on, brothers and sisters. That's why they presented you this already in the Matrix trilogy. The Matrix trilogy is the storyline of the singularity dash metaverse and all the things that are happening there. And where the scene where we see Neo coming, he is entering a water, and then he comes up out of the water and he sees all around him pots with human babies in it. This is already how Marduk is telling us what is going on and what is already happening. And the same in the X-Files. The X-Files also is telling very much the story and the creational line of the singularity metaverse. Avatar movie is also giving us a lot of information about the world of singularity and thus the metaverse, and how avatars are being created. But the majority, unfortunately, of beautiful humans are seeing this still as sci-fi, but nothing is sci-fi. No sci-fi movie or teleseries is sci-fi. It is literally telling us the playbook through which Enki is playing and Marduk is playing. We see sometimes Enki's playbook being played out through the movies and teleseries, and then we see Marduk's playbook being played out through movies and teleseries. And my best guess is that this Netflix channel is completely in the hands of Marduk and is playing out Marduk's playbook. And so we see all sorts of movies and teleseries being presented that are in actuality telling us the playbook of Marduk. We need to wake up. I go on. But for that to happen, the Marduk bloodline needs to still be active and in majority when this part of the agenda is being employed. So now you get to understand why they needed to roll out this 2020 event and why they were telling people that they need to do all sorts of tests. Nose swapping, mouth swapping, PCR tests, and whatever tests they made humans believe to use. This was only, lovely brothers and sisters, to make sure that they could collect as much as possible DNA from all people they hoped for, so that they can get to know how many percentage of the human population already carries the Marduk genes in them. But unfortunately, for Marduk, not all people were so foolish to buy into that trap, because the 2020 circus was nothing more than a trap. We know very little about what Isis thought of all this. It is most likely she never managed to escape from Marduk, after he forced her to create the Marduk Isis lineage around 1200 BCE, when the 12 tribes of Israel were created. So this is also a creation. The 12 tribes were in naturalness not there, they were created. Yeah, and know the number 12 and how important the number 12 is. Why is Friday the 13th? Well, better said, the number 13, so heavenly, you can say, demonized in such a way, because that is the number of Queen Sophia, the divine feminine, the creatrix of this universe and of us. So the 12 tribes of Israel were created by Marduk and Isis. More about this later. And Marduk corrupted the pure Shem bloodline, which had been pure Enki Isis lineage for the first time. That was 800 years after Enki so-called disappeared in 2024 BCE. Thus the Hebrews, were Marduks and Enki's creation. So the Hebrews are a mix of Marduk DNA and Enki DNA. We may assume, even kijken hoor. Ja. We may assume she was his prisoner of sorts or in a trance. If this was the case, she, Isis, might have had little choice other than to comply. We must remember she was in the hands of the arch-narcissist of the universe, who became also a psychopath, and his psychopathic son since the beginning of the Matrix. The knowledge we have about narcissistic and psychopathic abuse on Earth tells us something. These two types of personalities rob their victims of their true personality, and they become their puppets, powerless objects. What do we see, lovely brothers and sisters? We see a lot of humans that feel themselves powerless and helpless. This is exactly one of the symptoms that also is in narcissistic relationships. The longer you are in a narcissistic relationship, eventually you start to feel yourselves powerless and helpless. This is exactly what we see in society. Those of you who have experienced or still experience narcissistic or psychopathic abuse can probably tell they feel like being in a trance. Indeed, Isis was probably not different. Well, we can say the entire human population is in a trance. This is this hypnosis that we are in on a collective level. We are in this deep trance. That is why they can manipulate and control us so easily. So wake the heck up and start see through this. After all, she is just a soul-mind with spirit from being a so-called lesser manifestation of Queen Sophia. She is like us in that sense. It is clear from my research that Isis played the role of both the Virgin Mary and Mary Magdalene, the latter being only 12-16 years older than Jesus according to scriptures. I would argue that Mary was about 13 years old when she gave birth to Jesus, because the number 13 has major energetic implications and is a divine number, and the number of the divine feminine who has created us. Queen Sophia, whose role Isis was now playing. The major suspicion that Virgin Mary and Mary Magdalene were one and the same gets somewhat confirmed in Christianity, which states that Mary Magdalene was somewhere between 46 and 49 years old when Jesus died on the cross at the age of 33. If the two Marys were the same Mary, Mary Magdalene was 13-16 years old when Jesus was born, which fits and eerily well into our hypothesis. I do not know whether all the details are correct in the above hypothesis, but regardless, the outcome is the same. Isis gave birth to Jesus, or better said, Marduk, and it was a, between quotation marks, virgin birth. Now Jesus had a perfect body of pure Isis, Ninurta, Marduk bloodline. And so with this said, I have come to the end of reading chapter 4 of this amazing, magnificent book titled The Story of Isis and the War on Bloodlines. I highly suggest you to buy this book yourselves. It is available on Amazon. It is loaded with so much interesting information. And it's about time for us people that we start to see the things for what they really and truly are. All right, I go on and proceed with the first pages of chapter 5, which is titled Mary Magdalene in Gaul, which is France. So I remove the pictures. Oh. Let me see, visual effects. All right. I do this so that people can see when a new chapter is being spoken of. All right. All right, Mary Magdalene in Gaul, France, part 1. The Priory of Sion. In 1982, journalists Michael Bygent and Richard Lee and Henry Lincoln published a controversial book called The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which almost immediately became a bestseller, but also the focus of much scrutiny, not surprisingly from the clergy of the Catholic Church, but also from the elite-controlled mainstream media, who, as usual, called in, between quotation marks, experts to debunk the content of this book. My readers might have heard of it and perhaps even read it. Author Dan Brown also used this book as an essential reference to his book, The Da Vinci Code. This book as an essential reference, better said, The Da Vinci, many years later. So Dan Brown also used this book as an essential reference to his book, The Da Vinci Code, many years later. As many people know, Dan Brown usually spends several years of research before he publishes a historical novel. He wants it to be as factual as possible at its core, and then he can put in an intriguing level of imagination on top of that. So the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail is well researched, arguing that Jesus did not die on the cross, but escaped together with Mary Magdalene to France, where they had at least one child, possibly more. The Holy Grail, or the Holy Graal means holy blood or royal blood, originating from sang real, which in medieval French means holy blood, suggesting that Jesus' blood supposedly ran through the veins of the Merovingian kings who reigned in France between 481 and 751 AD. This is, of course, blasphemy and heresy from Christian churches' perspectives, and therefore the research was attacked and ridiculed. Everybody knows Jesus died on the cross, but was strangely resurrected afterwards. However, the attacks did little good for the clergy. I would suggest it gave even more attention to the controversial research because the book sold amazingly well and it has nearly 5 stars on Amazon. So the book resonates with a lot of people, which is another indication there is truth in it. One of the big controversies is the author's claim there was and still is an organization called the Priory of Sion, working behind the scenes to preserve and protect the Jesus Magdalene bloodline with all their might. The authors, or better said writers, further claim it was this secret order that established the Knights Templar after the military order of the Catholic Church excavated Solomon's temple between 1119 and 1128. It was then the military order changed their title to the Knights Templar, named after Solomon's temple, or the Knights Templar was a public branch of the much more secret Priory of Sion, just like the Opus Dei is a branch of the Catholic Church. The Templar order was eventually demolished, as we will discuss in a while, although a faction of the order survived and has been incorporated into York Freemasonry and other diverse orders since then. But the Priory of Sion supposedly still exists and has operated under the radar since long before Jesus was born, protecting the Enki ISIS bloodline, since more of less the beginning of the Matrix. So the controversy regarding this order is that the Catholic Church and the media claim it as it has never existed. They argue it was a charlatan in modern times who came up with this nebulous idea of such an order, and he misled the writers of the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. It is true there was such a person, but he would also be a perfect cover up for the order, making it look ridiculous and like a hoax. If the Priory of Sion is real, which appears to be the case, they owe him for further occluding the order, which wants to be secret, but it is more likely that the so-called charlatan worked for the order all along and his job was to discredit it. So the debunkers of the order, of course, never took that into consideration. If I am correct in this, everything went per the plan. Almost. What they probably did not expect was the enormous success of the book The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. Even if the Priory of Sion never existed, it has no bearing on the narrative of this book. The fact remains there was a secret organization behind the scenes keeping the supposed Jesus bloodline safe and clean for almost 500 years, until the Merovingian kings openly came to power, something I will address soon. If the Priory of Sion never existed, a very similar organization must have existed in its place, protecting the bloodline. In that sense, the validity of that particular order is irrelevant. Therefore, I am using the information available about Sion. Since it is certain that an order of a similar foundation existed under that or some other name. Thus, I believe it is reasonable for our purpose to think of it as the Priory of Zion. For those who want to study the pros and cons of the existence of the order so they can build their own opinion, there is a website called The Templar Knights that discusses both sides of the story. For even more research about the Priory of Sion, I highly recommend this book, The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. There have been allegedly prominent scientists and artists being members of the Priory of Sion, such as Leonardo da Vinci and Isaac Newton. Dan Brown borrowed from this information when he wrote the Da Vinci Code. So here's some quotational text here. In The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail by Gent, Lee and Lincoln posit the existence of a secret society known as the Priory of Sion, which is supposed to have a long history starting in 1099 and had illustrious grandmasters including Leonardo da Vinci and Isaac Newton. According to the author's claims, the Priory of Sion is devoted to restoring the Merovingian dynasty, which ruled the Franks from 457 to 751 on the thrones of France and the rest of Europe. The priory is also said to have created the Knights Templar as its military arm and financial branch. I continue with the text of Wes Penre. Some might say it is the Catholic Church that protects the bloodline. And this is true, but even so, the Church has their own organizations to execute such tasks. There is no lack of evidence that the Catholic Church protects a certain bloodline, whether it is Jesus' bloodline or something else, which we will come to. Just consider whom they worship. Jesus and Mary. Catholics could ask themselves why the Church worships Mary, even more so than Jesus. From what I can see, the Church at its top level understands beyond reasonable doubt that the creatrix is feminine. So now we can ask, what is the Catholic Church hiding from us in their archives? because the Vatican, underneath the Vatican, there's a huge library, a huge archive. So there is stored probably the real storyline of us and thus also this earth. And the real storyline of all the players in this world, although they will never admit to it, or the church and the entire patriarchal Mardukian religion would crumble. The Roman Catholic Church is, between quotation marks, pagan at its roots, and the Pope functions as the middleman between this false god and humans, being his emissary on earth, and God is no longer Enki but Marduk. So now we get a deeper understanding whom is in actuality pulling the strings in the Vatican. So the Vatican, Rome, is on the hand of Marduk, who is Jesus and who is God. Yeah? I hope you still are with me. Now let us return to Jesus and Mary Magdalene, since we have discussed the same theme, that there has always been an occult organization protecting the Holy Grail. And with this said, I will do that the next time. Well, yeah, I will see. I continue a bit and then I'm halfway this chapter 5. Was there a real crucifixion? These days, I feel certain there was a Jesus slash Yeshua spreading, between quotation marks, God's message about whether he did it personally or the narrative was written afterward by the 4 evangelists. Marduk put his father, Enki, in a lofty position as the Almighty God, when indeed he was the opposite. He was not in a lofty position at all, but in the lowest position we can imagine, lacking all sorts of power. The Abzu, or also known as the abyss. Thus, even the story of his loftiness is inverted. We know very little about the true story of Jesus' life. Of course, we have the canon, we have the Gnostic texts, and we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. But Mark wrote the first known gospel about 70 CE, which was approximately 35 years after Jesus' alleged death on the cross. Thus, it would be reasonable to assume the Gospel of Mark tells the most accurate story of Jesus' life. But we cannot take this accuracy for granted. Mark could have been biased, and we do not know whose errand he was running. We have strong indications that Saint Paul, or Saul, was an initiate in secret societies, so Mark could have been, too. Other texts were written more than a century after Jesus' alleged death, and I would suggest most of them were channeled by Marduk, or one of his, between quotation marks, archangels. The big question many people, including scholars, have asked themselves if Jesus was crucified and resurrected, or has that been fabricated? There are reasons to vote both for or against it, and we won't know for sure. What speaks against it is that Marduk probably would not want to put himself in the horrific situation where he was crucified, and therefore, even though crucifixions regularly happened at that time, I would suggest Marduk was never on the cross. If indeed Jesus' verdict was to be executed in this fashion, he was replaced by someone else, as the Nag Hammadi suggests. Perhaps he was supposed to be crucified, but in the last moment, the conspirators exchanged Jesus to another person who was crucified in Jesus' place, and his name was Simon of Cyrene, who was the father of two of Jesus, his disciples. According to some Gnostic traditions, Simon of Cyrene, by mistaken identity, suffered the events leading up to the crucifixion. This is the story presented in the second treatise of the Great Seth. Although it is unclear whether Simon or another actually died on the cross, this is part of a belief held by some Gnostics that Jesus was not of flesh, but only took on the appearance of flesh. See also Basilides and swoon hypothesis. Basilides, in his Gospel of Basilides, is reported by Irenaeus as having taught a docetic doctrine of Christ's passion. He states the teachings that Christ, in Jesus, as a holy divine being, could not suffer bodily pain and did not die on the cross, but that the person crucified was in fact Simon of Cyrene. There is a relatively unknown Gnostic text called the Gospel of Basilides. Like other Gnostics, Basilides taught that salvation comes from knowledge, Greek gnosis, and not faith. This is what he wrote about the crucifixion. He, between brackets, Jesus appeared on earth as a man and performed miracles. Thus he himself did not suffer, rather a certain Simon of Cyrene was compelled to carry his cross for him. It was he who was ignorantly and erroneously crucified, being transfigured by him, so that he might be thought to be Jesus. So that he might be thought to be Jesus. Moreover, Jesus assumed the form of Simon and stood by, laughing at them. A common belief in those days was that divine beings could not suffer because they were not truly physical, which is an interesting point. People back then were completely comfortable with the thought that divine beings were astrophysical, i.e., they often appeared in their astral bodies, to use modern terms, in form of an apparition. This makes me think about Jesus' resurrection, because that is how it is usually described in religious texts, as an apparition. If we play with the above stories some, More, they nailed this Simon at the cross until he was dead. Then they took him down, and someone arranged a grave within a rock for him. There, the deceased Simon was again replaced with Marduk, who pretended to resurrect after 3 days. Here is what the Gospel of Mark tells us. Joseph of Arimathea is a member of the Sanhedrin, which had condemned Jesus, who wishes to ensure that the corpse is buried in accordance with Jewish law, according to which dead bodies could not be left exposed overnight. He puts the body in a new shroud and lays it in a tomb carved into the rock. The Jewish historian Josephus Flavius, writing later in the century, described how the Jews regarded this law as so important that even the bodies of crucified criminals would be taken down and buried before sunset. In this account, Joseph does only the bare minimum to observe the law, wrapping the body in a cloth with no mention of washing or anointing it. This may explain why Mark mentions an event prior to the crucifixion in which a woman pours perfume over Jesus. Jesus is thereby prepared for burial even before his actual death. If we want to be conspiratorial here, could Joseph of Arimathea, in the usual fashion, play both sides? He might not have been as condemning of Jesus as Mark wants us to believe. This theory is backed up by the Gospel of Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew was written around the years 80 to 85, using the Gospel of Mark as a source. In this account, Joseph of Arimathea is not referenced as a member of the Sanhedrin, but a wealthy disciple of Jesus. This version suggests a more honorable burial. Joseph wraps the body in a clean shroud and places it in his own tomb. And the word used is soma, body, rather than pneuma, corpse. The author adds that the Roman authorities made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard. Joseph hurried to make sure, between quotation marks, Jesus, between brackets, Simon, was buried immediately after he was pronounced dead on the cross. He quickly wrapped and put the body inside the rock away from prying eyes. Joseph cared little about anointing him if he was a part of Marduk's conspiracy. In the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verse 1, KJV, it says, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb on the first day of the week. And Mark 16, verse 1 and 2 says, after Sabbath, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Salome, bought spices to anoint Jesus' body, and they went to the tomb on the first day of the week. We must ask ourselves, was anointment the true reason for the visit? Did Isis, between brackets, Mary Magdalene, really have an interest in anointing Simon's body if we go for this hypothesis. After all, Marduk and Isis knew it was all a farce and couldn't care less about anointment. It is more likely that Isis, as Mary, entered the tomb and helped with the process of so-called bringing Jesus back to life, which means Simon's body was removed and Marduk took his place on the third day. And I think the Shroud of Turin is in actuality Marduk. It looked like he, between quotation marks, left the tomb on that third day when the resurrection of Christ happened, when he was never inside the tomb in the first place. All they did was to take out Simon's body, remove the stone. Of course, in these times, people were superstitious and many were afraid hearing that the stone placed in front of the tomb was removed. Jesus was gone, and the guards who had guarded the tomb on Pontius Pilate's order were now to be found. Instead, some eyewitness said the guards had been replaced by new, unknown guards acting as so-called angels, which adds to the supernatural and the divine. If Marduk, as Jesus, truly survived the crucifixion, between brackets, if there was one at all, there is some evidence that Jesus slash Marduk went to India after his so-called, between quotation marks, resurrection, while Mary Magdalene went to France. But why did Mary go to France of all places? Well, that is what we are going to investigate now, and this is where I will quit the reading of the first part of chapter 5. Tomorrow I will start with part 2 of chapter 5, and then we start with how Mary Magdalene ended up in France. So I want to say thank you for listening along to today, this morning, through Facebook, through Rumble, through YouTube. And thank you for tuning in. Thank you for taking this information into you. Ponder upon it, meditate upon it, and ask your spirit to help you to see this information from a more clear point of view. It is about time that we start to see the things in this world for what they truly are. So we need to look behind the curtain of the wizard. And this is what the movie The Wizard of Oz was all about. It was in actuality telling us whom the wizard of this world is. So we need to see behind the curtains, yeah? And we need to expose this Marduk figure in this world. The more we do, the better, the lesser grip he starts to have on us humans and on the human soul group. All right, I close off with a short piece of music composed by Ben Sound. It is called Hope, and I see you next time. Thank you again, and have a joyful day filled with a lot of love, joy, wisdom, truth, and revelations, all coming from your own spirit and your DNA. Thank you so much, and see you next time with a continuation of this book reading.